Hi guys! No, you're not reading the title of this video wrong. This really is my June wrap-up smack in the middle of July. What can I say? I traveled and then moved, and for the last week I've been eating Oreo ice cream with a shovel and avoiding all the life decisions I need to make. And also, I'm struggling with video motivation. I mean, there are plenty of videos I want to make, but when I get out of a video making rhythm, suddenly I'm like, how do you talk about books? Like, how did I do that before? So it's kind of a miracle that you're getting anything on the June books I read, considering my unofficial sponsorship of Inertia. June was a trash reading month, all things considered, but I still have 10 books to talk about, as usual, going from least favorite to favorite. And so the first one to mention was one that I DNF'd, You Will Know Me by Megan Abbott. I made a whole video about my decision to DNF this one, so if you're interested, it's linked down below. Next is one I got through NetGalley from Touchstone, Music of the Ghosts by Vaddey Ratner. You might recognize her name from her debut novel, In the Shadow of the Banyan, which I read earlier this year and really liked. That one is about a little girl who survives the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, and in a lot of ways, this second novel is a spiritual sequel to the debut. So Music of the Ghosts is about a woman named Tira who receives a letter from an old musician in Cambodia saying that he knew her father before he died. If you want to know my full reaction to this book, I'll link my Goodreads review down below. Usually I just do quick hits on Goodreads, but because of the NetGalley situation, this one is detailed. I go into this book's beauty and its problems. Then we have the historical fiction novel Anne Boleyn, A King's Obsession by the novelist and historian Allison Weir. I already did a full review on this one, talking about what I liked, what disappointed me, and why I love reading about the Tudors. If you're interested, that's linked down in the description box. I rarely read short story collections, but I did pick one up last month from an author who's fast becoming one of my favorites, Free Love and Other Stories by Ali Smith. And I have to say, overall, I was pretty underwhelmed by this. She's known for her short stories, so I assume that her later collections are more memorable than this one. Of the 12 stories, only a few stood out even soon after reading the collection, let alone now, a month later. But one of those is now one of my favorite short stories ever. It's called To the Cinema, and it encapsulates everything that I love about Smith's writing. It's offensively clever. There are surprising perspective shifts. It takes playful digs at specific movies and at the way we watch movies in public, how we perform our reactions in a movie theater. It also looks at the merging of actors and their off-screen lives with their performances, and at what makes a movie a classic, and at how tempting it is to fill your life with these immaculately constructed stories and to believe the lie that people care about them, when really most people walk out of the theater and happily ignore all the stories buried in the people around them. So if you can get your hands onto the cinema, do. Panning out, I'd say that I still enjoyed Smith's writing throughout this collection, even though I didn't find most of the stories memorable. So, if you're not already a fan of hers, you can probably skip this one, but if you like her writing, pick it up. My latest Open Letters Monthly review is on Standard Deviation by Katherine Heiny. This is her debut novel, and I read and loved her debut short story collection, Single Carefree Mellow. Heiny's a sharp, snarky voice in the vein of Lori Moore and Maria Semple, although Standard Deviation is a lot less biting than her short story collection. I had problems with this, which you can read about in the full review if you're interested, but it made me laugh out loud, and I still think about passages from this book and laugh a month later. So it's not groundbreaking fiction, but you can't beat it for a fun summer read. Then we have my play for the month, the classic A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. This is about a young couple named Stanley and Stella living in New Orleans in the 1940s, and Stella's sister Blanche comes to visit. And Blanche is a classic curator of her identity and past, and she has her own special personalized version of reality. I haven't seen the movie yet, although I plan to, but in some ways this is a great play to read because Williams really sets the scene for you. He gives you a lot of stage directions, detailed stage directions, to help you get the mood shifts of the settings and characters both during scenes and between scenes. But this is such a physical and oral play, physical in the presence that the characters are meant to have, especially Stanley. He has this raw sexuality to him, and it's summer and everything's hot and dripping, and the words create a sultry feeling, but they can't compare to seeing a human being sweat or looking at this tiny apartment where the characters keep butting up against each other. I imagine this would be a really claustrophobic visual experience. And there are a lot of musical stage directions. There are blues tunes that are supposed to creep in at significant moments. So I definitely recommend you read this. Williams is known for a kind of off-kilter poetry to his dialogue, but more so than some other plays, there are ingredients missing in the reading experience. Next are 3 nonfiction books. The first is Zinky Boys by Svetlana Alexievich, who's a Belarusian writer who's become a lot more famous in the English-speaking world since she won the Nobel Prize for Literature a couple years ago. She's an investigative journalist and a nonfiction writer, and this is about the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s, and it gets its title from the fact that most of the men who were killed in combat, the Soviet men, were sent back home in cheap zinc coffins. This is a series of interviews with war vets, former doctors, nurses, civilian employees, most of whom were women, mothers of dead soldiers, and widows. And as you can guess from that lineup, it's brutal. For those of you who don't know, memorializing World War II is like a kind of religion in Russia. It's called the Great Patriotic War. Victory Day is one of the most important holidays all year. The annual celebration of men in Russia is called Defender of the Fatherland Day, okay? World War II casts a long shadow in Russian society. Nobody talks about the Soviet-Afghan War, and in fact, nobody talked about it even when it was happening. The light is changing because there's like biblical weather outside the window right now. Anyway, nobody talked about the Soviet-Afghan War, and in fact, facts and details of it were kept out of the press at the time. But the men fighting in the Afghanistan War had grown up in a culture that treated World War II veterans like gods, and fighting for your country like it was the greatest possible way to serve it. And they got to Afghanistan and found that there was no cohesive ideology, purpose, or strategy, and that people were just getting blown up left and right. Afghan civilians were throwing grenades at soldiers. Soldiers were gunning down civilians. There was us and them, but there were no clear good guys and bad guys, and most unnervingly, there was no obvious honor in any of it. So all these young men died, and families were destroyed for nothing, essentially. The ones who did survive came back with all kinds of PTSD, and years later, when it was finally acknowledged that this had happened, it was to criticize it publicly and to say that the whole war effort had been shameful. So there are a lot of obvious parallels with the Vietnam War in the US, but you add to that situation the culture of state-sponsored silence, and you get this book, which is a tribute to people who have been haunted by things that they can't speak about. I highly recommend it. The next nonfiction book was a reread for me called Myrn Amsterdam, Liberal Europe, Islam, and the Limits of Tolerance by Ian Buruma. Buruma was just named editor of the New York Review of Books, and so I did a little blurb on this that's linked down below for Open Letters Monthly Summer Recommendations issue. I know my usual OLM reviews are long. This really is just a blurb, short and sweet, so go check it out if you want to see why I think this is such a readable, important book. And as a bonus, it's under 300 pages. The next one is easily the best book that I read all month, The Red Parts Autobiography of a Trial by Maggie Nelson. Nelson's Aunt Jane was violently murdered in her 20s before Nelson was born, and her killer was brought to trial over 30 years later. I'm not going to say much more about this because I'm planning to do a full comparison review on it once I've also read Nelson's poetry collection called Jane, a Murder on the same topic. But let me just say that The Red Parts is much more accessible than The Argonauts, and staggeringly good. And my favorite book of the month, oh god, the sun's coming out. I hate you too. And my favorite book of June was The Madwoman Upstairs by Katherine Lowell. This is like somebody took me to the book equivalent of the Build-A-Bear Factory and was like, what do you need? And then Lowell wrote this book for me. This follows Samantha, who's just starting her literature studies at Oxford, but the special detail here is that she's the last descendant of the Brontes, and she has a complicated relationship with her family legacy. It gets her a lot of unwanted attention, and she's critical of the Brontes' works, and that's one of the most enjoyable aspects of the book. She doesn't treat these women like they're goddesses, like they're literary giants. She looks at them as weirdos who are chock full of insecurities and secrets. I acknowledge that those are elements of the Brontes, but like most people, I talk about these writers like they're up on a pedestal. The Madwoman Upstairs clearly comes from a place of love and admiration, but nevertheless it shines lights on these sisters that are often muted. This book is a literary romp with mystery, romance, lots of witty banter, debates about how to read classics, and simple but stylish prose. It's funny because a lot of the Goodreads reviews say things like, the main character is so annoying and inconsistent. I identified with her, okay? I thought Samantha was hilarious. Now, I admit, if I step back from how much I love this book, that a lot of the plot points are trite, especially towards the end. And for those of you who have read it, I interpreted the epilogue as fantasy, or else I would have been annoyed. But I'm not going to pretend that I care about this book's flaws because I had so much fun reading it. If you enjoy references to Gothic lit, and if you like this narrator's voice, you're gonna love this book. There we go. Oh my god, this is such a nightmare to film because I'm rusty and iMovie is Satan. I can't wait until I buy a real camera next week and can film like a real person. Anyway, my next wrap-up's gonna be a lot more legit than that one, alright? I apologize if that was like a rambling mess, but I'll see you soon for a video review of 2 books that I hauled recently. I loved both of them and I can't wait to talk about them with you. Bye guys. Thanks for watching.